The first time it happened after marriage, she felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. She woke up before him, as she usually did. The early morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting gentle shadows across the room. Everything was quiet, peaceful. But as she shifted slightly in bed, she felt it. A cold dampness beneath her. Her body stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. No, not again. Her pulse quickened, panic seizing her as she carefully lifted the blanket, confirming her worst fear. It had happened again. Her heart pounded as she turned her head slightly to check if he was awake. His chest rose and fell in steady breaths. His face relaxed in sleep. She had time. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, she peeled back the sheets, heart thudding against her ribs. She had spent years learning how to cover this up, how to hide her shame before anyone noticed. But this was different. She wasn't alone anymore. She gritted her teeth and tried to suppress the overwhelming humiliation creeping up her throat like bile. This was her secret, one she had fought so hard to keep, one she had believed would go away with time. But time had betrayed her. She tiptoed to the bathroom, grabbing a towel, pressing it against the damp spot, hoping it would soak up enough that he wouldn't notice. She could wash the sheets later, pretend it never happened. She thought she had succeeded, until she turned back toward the bed and found him staring at her. Her breath hitched. He was propped up on one elbow, his expression groggy yet puzzled. His gaze flickered to the towel in her hand, then to the bed, where the evidence of her humiliation lay exposed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he frowned. "Did you seriously wet the bed?" She flinched as if he had slapped her. Heat burned her cheeks, and her fingers tightened around the towel. 1,000 responses swirled in her head, but none of them came out. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell him that this wasn't something she could control, that she had battled this issue since childhood, that she had tried everything, doctors, treatments, home remedies. But instead, she stood there, frozen in shame. His frown deepened. He rubbed his forehead as if trying to process what he had just woken up to. Then, to her horror, he let out a small, disbelieving chuckle. "You're joking, right?" His lips curled in amusement. "I thought only kids did that." Her stomach twisted painfully. She turned away, gripping the towel harder, trying to steady her breathing. She had imagined so many scenarios about how he might react if he ever found out. But she had never expected cruelty. When she didn't respond, he sat up fully. "Wait, are you serious?" His voice was laced with something between shock and disgust. "This actually happens?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at him. "It's not like I do it on purpose." He scoffed. "Well, obviously. But come on, how does this even happen? You're a grown woman." She felt like curling into herself, disappearing into the floor. She had feared this moment all her life. The moment someone she cared about would look at her like she was broken. He ran a hand through his hair, still processing. "I mean, this is weird, right? Like, really weird. Shouldn't this have stopped by now?" She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain that she had been to specialists, that some nights were better than others, that stress made it worse. But his next words shattered whatever courage she had built up. "This is disgusting." Tears burned her eyes. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the blanket, anything to hide her face. She wouldn't let him see her cry. Not now. Not like this. He sighed loudly, as if this was something she had done to inconvenience him. "Seriously, what am I supposed to do with this? Sleep in a wet bed every night. I married a wife, not a child." The words cut deep, slicing through her like a blade. She wanted to scream at him, to make him understand how much she had struggled with this, how much she had hated herself for it. But all she did was clench the towel in her hands and swallow her pain. "I'll fix it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll clean everything. You won't have to deal with it." He let out a dry laugh. "I hope so." Then, without another word, he got up and walked out of the room. The moment the door shut behind him, she let the tears fall. She had always feared this part of herself, had always prayed that one day it would go away. But more than anything, she had feared this exact reaction, the disgust, the judgment, the humiliation. And now, that fear had come true. She sank onto the edge of the bed, gripping the sheets in her hands. If only he knew the truth. If only he knew what her body was going through. If only he knew the pain she had endured trying to fight this. If only he knew that she had spent years waking up in tears, praying for a miracle that never came. But he didn't know, and the way he had treated her tonight made her wonder if he even cared. She wiped her face quickly, steeling herself. She wouldn't let this break her. She had been dealing with this long before he ever came into her life, and she would deal with it long after. What she didn't know was that soon the truth would come out, and when it did, he would regret every single word. The following days were filled with silence, not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that weighed heavily in the air, thick with unspoken words. He had stopped sharing the bed with her. The first night after he discovered her secret, he had grabbed a pillow and stormed off to the living room. She had watched in silence, her throat too tight with shame to say anything. Maybe it was temporary, she told herself. Maybe he just needed time to process it. But night after night, he continued sleeping on the couch. And in the mornings, his remarks began. At first, they were subtle. "I barely got any sleep last night. That couch is killing my back." Or, "Do you think you'll ever, outgrow it?" She would force a smile, pretend she didn't hear the edge of sarcasm in his voice. But soon, the comments turned sharper. One morning, she had woken up to find him staring at her with a smirk. "I was thinking, maybe we should get you some diapers. Would save me a lot of trouble." Her entire body went stiff. She looked at him, waiting for him to say he was joking, that he didn't mean it. But he just stood there, chuckling to himself before walking away. The pain burned deep in her chest. She had spent her whole life hiding this, trying to find a solution. She had read medical journals, visited doctors, tried different treatments. None of them worked. And now, the person who was supposed to love her the most was mocking her for something beyond her control. She tried to explain it to him once. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, she built up the courage to speak. This isn't something I can control," she said, keeping her voice calm. "It's a medical condition. Some people struggle with it their whole lives." He scoffed. "So what? I'm just supposed to accept that my wife is—" He shook his head. "Never mind." Her fingers curled into fists under the table. "Say it," she whispered. He set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. "It's embarrassing. I married a woman, not a child. What do I even tell people? That my wife wets the bed like a 5-year-old. Her stomach twisted painfully. "You don't have to tell anyone," she said softly. "This is private. It's something I've been dealing with for years. I just need support." "Support?" He let out a dry laugh. "What am I supposed to do? Applaud you every morning when you manage to stay dry?" Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She looked down at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork. She had thought marriage would be different. That love meant understanding. That love meant standing by someone's side no matter what. But now she wasn't so sure. Days passed, and his words became sharper, more cruel. One night, after another argument, he threw his hands in the air and said, "Who would ever want a woman like you?" That night, she cried herself to sleep. She thought of all the times she had comforted him when he was sick, all the times she had stood by him during his struggles. And yet, when she needed him the most, all he did was humiliate her. She started staying up later than him, waiting until he was asleep before sneaking into bed. She would set alarms to wake up before him, rushing to check the sheets, praying that they would be dry. Some nights they were. Other nights, she would feel that dreaded cold dampness beneath her, and the wave of shame would crash over her all over again. She washed the sheets in secret, scrubbing away any trace before he could see. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wash away the pain of his words. The worst part wasn't even the insults. It was the way he looked at her now. Like she was less of a woman. Like she was a burden. She didn't recognize him anymore. The man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once held her so gently, now looked at her with disgust. And she didn't recognize herself either. She had always been strong, confident. But now she felt small. But everything changed the night she collapsed. It started with an ache in her lower abdomen. She had felt discomfort before, but this was different. It was sharp, stabbing, making her double over in pain. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it would go away. But it didn't. The pain only got worse, spreading through her body like fire. Then, suddenly, everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was in a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. She blinked, trying to adjust to the bright lights. Her head was spinning, her body weak. And then she saw him. He was standing by the door, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced by something else, something that almost looked like fear. "What happened?" she managed to whisper. He hesitated before stepping closer. "The doctors, they ran tests," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it in weeks. "They found something." She frowned. "Found what?" He swallowed hard, and when he finally spoke, his voice shook. "A condition," he admitted. "Something serious. They said it's been affecting your body for years." Her breath caught. A condition. Something she had no control over. Something that explained everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the relief of knowing that there was a reason for her struggles, but from the realization that all this time he had mocked her, shamed her, for something she couldn't change. And now he knew the truth, and for the first time he was the one who looked ashamed. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a rhythmic reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still fighting. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like fighting. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, the sterile white hospital walls closing in around her. The pain in her lower abdomen was dull now, muted by medication, but the heaviness in her chest was unbearable. She wasn't alone. He was there, sitting in the chair beside her bed, silent, stiff, as if he didn't know how to be in this room with her. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. He looked different. Gone was the usual arrogance, the mockery, the cold indifference. For the first time in weeks, he looked uncertain. She cleared her throat, her voice hoarse from sleep. "How long have I been here?" He shifted in his seat. "A few hours." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You passed out. They had to run tests." "Tests." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to sit up slightly. "What did they find?" He opened his mouth, but for a moment, nothing came out. He looked at her as if he was struggling to find the right words, the right way to tell her something he never thought he'd have to say. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand down his face. You have a medical condition," he admitted. "Something that affects your bladder control. The doctor said it's been happening for years, probably your whole life. But it's not your fault. Not your fault." The words echoed in her head, wrapping around her like a bittersweet comfort. She had spent years blaming herself, wondering if she was broken, hating herself for something she couldn't control. And now here was the truth, laid out in clinical terms, undeniable and irrefutable. Her fingers clenched the hospital blanket as she exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "So," she said, her voice carefully even, "I wasn't just some overgrown child then?" His face paled. I wasn't disgusting. I wasn't an embarrassment." He winced, his jaw tightening. Guilt. For the first time, he looked guilty. She shook her head, a bitter smile forming on her lips. "All those things you said, the jokes, the insults, the way you looked at me like I was some kind of burden." Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. "And now, suddenly, I have a condition. Now, suddenly, it's not my fault." He rubbed his hands together, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't know," he muttered. She let out a humorless laugh. "You didn't bother to know." His head snapped up, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "I was ignorant, okay? I thought—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "I thought it was just laziness or something psychological. I didn't think it was a real medical issue." She scoffed. "And that made it okay to humiliate me?" Silence. He had no answer to that. She turned her head away, staring at the window. Outside, the world moved on as if nothing had changed. As if her world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The truth had finally come out. She wasn't broken. She wasn't disgusting. She had been sick all along. And the man who had vowed to love her, to support her in sickness and in health, had made her feel like she was worthless instead. A long silence stretched between them, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down like a heavy fog. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes, taking in the words. "Sorry. It wasn't enough. Not after all the nights she had cried in silence, feeling like she was unworthy of love. Not after the shame he had forced her to carry like a scar she could never erase. But at the same time, it was something. She turned to face him again, her expression unreadable. "I don't need your apology." He flinched slightly, but nodded. "I know, but I needed to say it." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. "Because I was wrong, and because I don't know if I can ever undo the damage I caused." She exhaled slowly, her heart heavy. "No," she said. "You can't." The reality of those words hit him hard. She could see it in his expression. The understanding that no matter how much he regretted it, he couldn't erase what he had done to her. She had a choice to make now, to forgive or to walk away, to hold on to the pain or to release it. She had spent so long feeling powerless, feeling like her condition defined her. But now, she realized, the real problem had never been her condition. It had been him. She had been fighting the wrong battle all along. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need his validation to feel whole. She was enough. As she was. She straightened her shoulders, a new kind of strength settling into her bones. "You should go home," she said finally. His brows furrowed. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I need time." He hesitated, searching her face for something, maybe a sign that she would forgive him, that things could go back to normal. But there was nothing. Finally, he stood. "I'll be here if you need me," he said quietly. She didn't respond. She just watched as he walked out the door, leaving her alone in the hospital room. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. She felt free. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something new. The hospital room was quiet now. Too quiet. She could still hear his words echoing in her mind. "I'm sorry." It was strange how two words could carry so much weight, yet feel so empty at the same time. She didn't doubt that he regretted the way he had treated her. The guilt on his face, the hesitation in his voice, she had seen it all. But regret wasn't enough. It didn't erase the pain he had caused. It didn't undo the months of humiliation, the careless words that had shattered her self-worth, the nights she had spent crying into her pillow, feeling like she was broken beyond repair. She glanced at the 4 drip beside her, the slow drip of saline, keeping her hydrated. The doctors had explained everything. A medical condition. A legitimate, diagnosable issue. Something she could have gotten help for if she hadn't been so ashamed, so afraid of being judged. She had spent her entire life blaming herself. And he had made it worse. She closed her eyes, exhaling a slow breath. For years, she had convinced herself that love meant enduring pain. That marriage meant staying no matter how much it hurt. But as she lay there, staring at the sterile white ceiling, she realized something. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Love wasn't supposed to be cruel. Love wasn't supposed to make her feel small, unworthy, disgusting. Love wasn't supposed to make her cry herself to sleep every night. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been too scared to face. Did she even want to stay? A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned her head, expecting to see a nurse. But instead, her sister walked in. Her heart clenched. Her sister had always been the one person she could count on. The one who had held her when she cried as a child, who had defended her against school bullies, who had always known when something was wrong, even when she tried to hide it. And now, as her sister sat beside her bed, she could see the concern written all over her face. "I came as soon as I heard," her sister said gently, taking her hand. "Are you okay?" She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I will be." Her sister studied her for a long moment. Then she sighed. "He told me what happened." She stiffened. "And—" her sister's jaw clenched. "And I wanted to slap him." A small, bitter smile tugged at her lips. "I think a lot of people would." Her sister squeezed her hand. "You deserve better than this." The words hit her harder than she expected. Because deep down, she had always wondered, had always doubted herself, had always thought that maybe she was asking for too much. But hearing it from someone else, from someone who truly loved her, made it feel real. Her voice trembled. "I don't know what to do." Her sister's expression softened. "You don't have to decide right now. But whatever you choose, don't do it because you feel guilty. Don't do it because you're afraid. Do it because it's what you truly want. She bit her lip, looking away. I don't think I can go back. Her sister nodded. Then don't. It was said so simply, as if leaving was as easy as walking out the door, as if she hadn't spent years convincing herself that staying was the right thing to do. But maybe it was that simple. Maybe she had made it harder than it needed to be. Maybe the hardest part wasn't leaving. Maybe it was believing that she deserved to. 2 days later, she was discharged from the hospital. He came to pick her up. The drive home was silent. He kept glancing at her, like he wanted to say something, but he never did. When they got home, he finally spoke. I want to fix this, he said, his voice hesitant. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't undo what I did, but I can do better. She stared at him. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he truly wanted to change, but the damage had already been done. I need time, she said quietly. His shoulders sagged, but he nodded. I understand. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, fear. The fear of losing her. But what he didn't realize was that he had already lost her the moment he made her feel like she wasn't worthy of love. She walked past him into the bedroom and started packing her things. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to throw things or demand apologies. She was done. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his face pale. You're really leaving? She zipped up her suitcase. Yes. He took a step closer. Please don't. She turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on. If you had known the truth from the beginning, would you have treated me differently? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. And that was all the answer she needed. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. For the first time in years, she felt light, free. As she stepped outside, the sun warming her skin, she knew this was the beginning of a new chapter. And this time, she was choosing herself. No more shame, no more pain, no more staying where she wasn't valued. As she walked away, she didn't look back. Because she didn't need to.